At any street corner, the feeling of absurdity can strike any man in the face, as it is in its distressing nudity, in its light without effulgence. It is elusive.
From this sad world, come wander with me.
Before I start this next chapter, I'd like to thank the people at Existentialism Reddit for giving me actually pretty good criticism on a video I asked to be criticized. I didn't expect so much candor and honesty from them, and I really appreciate the advice a lot of them gave me, so again, thank you to the people who contributed to my post on Reddit. You essentially made this next video better, so thank you. Now let's digest the second chapter of the myth of Sisyphus called Absurd Walls. Like great works, deep feelings always mean more than they are conscious of saying. They light up their passion an exclusive world in which they recognize their climate. Oh yeah, get ready for this chapter because it's as lyrical and as hard to understand as that quote above, but for us, less great with words. Camus opens saying great feelings mean more than anything else, and that we frame our world and see it through the perspective and the point of view of that feeling. The feeling of jealousy frames our world. Even generosity affects our outlook on the world. It's more of like a metaphysical perceiving of what our world is. This POV and perception is the way we look at the world. You think of the world bad and the world would seem bad to you. You think of the world good and it looks good to you. That's what essentially this means. And our good friend, the old painful pal, the absurd, frames how we perceive the world, being the elusive, destructive thing that it is. This is the focus of the chapter, and Albert tries to explain how we feel the absurd on the experience level and how we can feel it on the intellectual level. He acknowledges he can't explain to us a feeling, more or less something as big as the absurd. But the first one we're going to look at, feeling the absurd on the emotional/experience level, he is going to go into 5 scenarios where we feel the absurd through experience on our daily basis. The first scenario is the mechanical life, the Monday to Friday job that drains you and leaves you weary. But one day, the why arises, and everything begins in that weariness tinged with amazement. This question, why, brings forth the absurd. Why this dull mechanical life? The other scenario is seeing the world naked of the meaning we blanket it in. When the feeling of absurd hits us, we look at a stone and see it not as a stone but a collection of atoms, or a table as chopped up piece of tree that we shoved and put together to eat food on it. We lose the illusionary meaning with which we had clothed them in. This realization of the nudity of the world and its lack of meaning is another way the absurd can creep into our life. The scenarios Albert gives us are how we can feel the absurd on a human level in our daily lives as we walk through it, because it can hit us at any street corner of any day. And now I'll get into the second part and how we could feel the absurd on the intellectual level. The mind's first step is to distinguish what is true from what is false. However, as soon as thought reflects on itself, what is first discovered is a contradiction. Albert's quote alludes to how we feel the absurd on the intellectual level and how we come to it. It is a vicious cycle which is caused by our desire to understand the universe by unity. The mind's deepest desire in the face of his universe is an appetite for clarity. Understanding the world for a man is reducing it to the human. This nostalgia for unity is a way to make sense of the universe, to reduce it in a way that we can understand. We would love to think the universe suffers and loves like us. That would make all of this go away. We would have one unified truth. And that's the problem. We want a unified truth, something that collectively puts the universe into one so we can finally understand it. But Camus gives a quote by Aristotle on how a unified truth is flawed, and that a unified truth is impossible, it can never happen. But we humans really want one. We try to look one through science. And Camus debates scientific theory only describes something, but never really tells us how everything works. Because you look at an atom, but then you can go further and you see the protons and neutrons and electrons. And then you go even smaller and you see the elementary particles, but we can't go smaller than that. There are so many layers of reality that there can never be one unified single truth. And that's where the feeling of absurd is. On an intellectual level, you realize there is never going to be a unified truth. And that is the absurd on the intellectual level, that the universe is irrational and there is no single truth, or one that you will never find. And this finally gives us an idea and a clear picture of the absurd. Seeing the absurd on an emotional level and intellectual level finally pinpoints us what it is. And this is very important because the absurd is very hard to understand, so I'll try to make it as simple as possible if this video isn't already confusing. So what is the absurd as we learned from the feeling and intellectual? The absurd only exists when we wish for clarity from the universe, but ultimately it is irrational. In a simpler term, the absurd is the contradiction of men seeking meaning in an indifferent, uncaring, dead universe. That is why Camus focused it from intellectual and feeling, to show us the connection of where the absurd is and finally understand what that thing is that makes us feel so bad. And he tells us he isn't the only one and we aren't the only ones who discovered this absurd universe. Some of the thinkers Camus lists off are people we already know about, like Hedegaard, Jaspers, Chestov, Kierkegaard, and Husserl's, all big existential people. People like us who have come to the conclusion of what the absurd is and finally understand what it is. This is why this chapter is very important to understand, because it shows us a clear picture of what the absurd is. We now have a clear image of what it is, with notable philosophers who identify it too. With this clear image of the absurd in our minds, we can understand the choices of suicide from the last chapter, or we can run into the other choice, hope, which I mentioned briefly the last time. These are the choices we get after facing the absurd, and in chapter 3, we look at the choice of hope, or as Camus calls it, philosophical suicide. See you in the next chapter.
How many roads must a man
Vincent.
walk down before you call him a man? How many seas must the white dove sail before she sleeps in the sand?